get into them. So the sort of theme for our discussion is the future of the EA movement, future of EA. So to start off with, what do you see as sort of the main trajectory or the key defining features that are going to be critical for EA over the next 10 years or so?
Yeah, I think there were a few. So I think one very concrete and obvious one is the growth of the Overhang project, where they currently are spending about $200 million per year. That's going to ramp up to about $1 billion per year, or a little under that. And so how to spend that size of money, especially where they're focused on what are currently smaller causes like factory farming and various existential risk causes, how to spend that money really well is going to be a really massive challenge. It's necessarily going to involve like using and having involved a lot of people who don't identify as EAs right now. I'm pretty confident. Second is, I think, kind of mainstreaming of the weirder aspects of EA among at least the kind of like elites of society, where that's already been happening so far with kind of artificial intelligence. It's just much more like a mainstream debate than it ever used to be. I think that's, you know, somewhat likely to happen for other things like wild animal suffering and so on. Again, I think that can cause kind of people who don't necessarily self-identify as EAs to be just working in these areas just because they think it's important, even if they don't have the whole kind of EA cause prioritization worldview. And then a third really defining thing that's much harder to predict is just, you know, what will happen with the development of artificial intelligence. It's plausible that development will continue at the same rapid clip that it has so far, in which case we might well see really radical changes over the next 10 years. It's also very plausible that, you know, AI development will just hit a wall and there won't be that much more interesting development, in which case then, you know, it will be important for EA to be nimble and those, like, perhaps many of those resources that have been devoted to AI, you know, be able to be, like, used for other things.
Right, so do you think that the technological trajectory of AI is particularly important for Effective Altruism as a movement to be sort of always involved and check our strategy on
that? Yeah, I found that a bit hard to hear, but I do think it is, insofar as, again, kind of open philanthropy being such a major player, and they will be scaling up this funding. Like, they're already funding kind of $50–60 million. I do think it's a bit of a defining moment insofar as, in terms of public perception, this is some like pretty weird idea that like EA has like put its bets on. And though I think this would be unfair, I can imagine EA getting like judged on the basis of whether the importance of this technology materializes or not, even though obviously it's more like an expected value argument.
So you've already touched on this a little bit, but what are the main sort of threats or challenges that you might see for EA going forward as a movement?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are many, as for any movement. I think there's a lot of standard threats. So looking at other social movements, why do they fall apart? Well, one big thing is often infighting between slightly differently aligned groups. Second is scandal among some of, you know, the leaders and so on. I'll try my best to avoid that. Third is a kind of like value drift where, you know, your goals just change a little bit over time. Or final one, I think, is probably quite common, is just people getting bored and going on to do other things. I think we've been taking quite a lot of, putting quite a lot of work onto these issues, you know, at the moment and in the past. The one that I've been thinking the most, at least, about, not to say it's the kind of biggest risk, is just groupthink. So insofar as we've been making like a ton of progress on like key areas, it's really easy, I think, and natural to like lock into those areas and to think, okay, what we're doing now is just trying to achieve a certain relatively small set of goals, rather than being this kind of like intellectual, open-ended kind of project and question. And that, you know, has benefits. It means you're going to do better at achieving those goals. Like, conformity of belief is very good if you're kind of an army and you're trying to get to some end state. But there's a big risk that we just like miss something hugely important. And so I think managing that balancing act is, that's going to be a real challenge, I think.
So you talked about the balancing act, and I think that it's interesting. On the one hand, you're concerned about groupthink, sort of everyone pushing in the same direction, and on the other hand, you're concerned about sort of splintering or internal infighting in the movement. So, I mean, how do we navigate between those sort of two extremes?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I mean, my view is kind of like you have groupthink at the meta level. So there has to be some amount of kind of groupthink. That's what you're defining yourself as a movement compared to other things, like what makes you interested in effective altruism or an aspiring effective altruist compared to other people. And I think the kind of three criteria is like decision theory, epistemology, and moral philosophy. So like first is that it's, you're maximizing, trying to do as much good as possible. Second is like you're broadly science aligned. Maybe even broadly Bayesian. And then thirdly is that you're kind of impartial, care about everyone equally, and broadly focused on well-being. So trying to make people better off rather than kind of other goals. And that already, most people in the world do not think about their kind of place in the world as in those terms. So that's already like making quite a significant kind of stake against contemporary thinking. But at the same time, there's space for tons of kind of disagreement within that paradigm. And that's, my best guess at like how to kind of strike the balancing act.
So building on from that, regarding the degree of philosophical disagreement that exists or can exist within the EA community, do you think that we should sort of push towards sort of adopting a position, like, for example, should we try to defend utilitarianism or other consequentialist ethics, or is that not so much of a priority if people are on board with other EA ideas, but come from different philosophical backgrounds?
Yeah, I think no to the utilitarianism or consequentialism defense. I mean, so I've just set up an institute, Oxford Global Priorities Institute, and like about half the people we've hired are non-consequentialists. And I think that's quite indicative of the fact that EA is quite deliberately a kind of broad tent. So going back to kind of what was definitive of EA, it's like, caring about everyone equally, being maximizing in your attempts to, help other people as much as possible and being kind of science aligned. In nowhere does that say, firstly, that you can like any ends justify the means. So you should kill one person to save 5, nor does it say that for every single like unit of resources you have, you ought to spend that money in whatever way or spend that time in whatever way will do the most good. So it really is a project that I think a very wide variety of different moral views can get behind. And so I think it would be a shame if it were very closely associated with utilitarianism, just because as a contingent matter, many of the kind of progenitors, including myself, are like sympathetic to utilitarianism.
Do you think there are any, or what are the best philosophical or perhaps more popular arguments against key EA ideas that you've come across?
I mean, I think the most controversial kind of aspect of EA is, long-termism, the idea that most of the impact that most of the impact of our actions today is determined by how those actions impact the kind of very long run. And then in particular, the kind of focus on reducing existential risks. I think there's like tons of very reasonable arguments you can make against that. You could have a person-affecting view. You only care about making people better off. You don't care about bringing more people into the future. You could be skeptical about like relying on kind of mushier or lower probabilities where things are much more uncertain. There's also kind of philosophical issues about why you care about very large amounts of value, but not like infinite amounts of value. All of these, I think, are like perfectly reasonable. So I think this is one area where, there just is like tons of ground for kind of reasonable debate. And I think that's much more so than a concern for like suffering of animals and factory farms, which I just think is, morally speaking, like pretty pretty uncontroversial, and I think arguments against it kind of have to be in bad faith. And actually, even similarly for global health and development as well, for the sort of targeted interventions that, say, GiveWell recommends, it's pretty limited on the degree of there's actually not that much controversy about whether this is a good or a bad thing. Obviously, a question about whether it's the best thing, but that you're doing some amount of good is like pretty uncontroversial, I think.
So turning to this question about the different cause areas in EA, especially sort of far future versus more present-based causes, how do we as a movement adjudicate the different views of different EAs about this? And there's lots of sort of practical ways that this can be manifested. For example, when we're planning this conference, we have to decide how much time do we devote to global poverty versus animal ethics versus far future and other things like that. And so what's your view about how EA should sort of make these decisions and adjudications, and how we deal with that internally?
Okay, yeah. I mean, one thing that I tend to think that's maybe a bit different from how other people think is, I think I just place less weight on resolving disagreement and more weight on kind of cooperation and trade than other people. So to be clear, I think like everyone should take real time, as in years of their life potentially, just to figure out what their views are on these kind of deep moral and philosophical questions, and even empirical questions as well, before deciding kind of like where are they trying to stake their bets, like what have they concluded are the problem that they think is like most pressing. But once someone has done that, people just are going to disagree. And once someone has thought about a bunch of issues for a while, I just think they tend to not change their mind, whether that's rational or not. In which case, I worry that like emphasizing the idea of resolving disagreement. Well, firstly, I worry it leads to groupthink. Second, I worry that it creates like this in-group, out-group feeling if someone comes to a different view than you. So I would much rather strongly encourage norms of cooperation. So it's like you and I agree at this kind of meta level on the maximizing science-aligned kind of welfarist approach, and then come to like maybe quite significant disagreements. Maybe actually we're even like opposed on some things. That doesn't mean we can't cooperate. So suppose you think something's really great and I think something's really terrible. We can come together and say, okay, neither of us will take action on this thing. We'll both do some second best thing that we both think is like kind of good, even if it wasn't a top option. And then similarly, like, so both that's a kind of practical thing of like actually trying to work together with people who have very different views than you. And then there's also, I think, just a somewhat vaguer but just as important kind of cultural thing as well, which is like, if you have some view I strongly disagree with, not saying like, wow, you're the person with a really weird view, and instead just being like kind of cognitively empathetic about that, and still saying, well, you agree on the kind of broad outline, so you're still like a very valued part of this community. So that's my general approach.
So bearing in mind that there's disagreement amongst EAs about what the most effective cause is and how to understand that, what are your thoughts about what the most effective cause is?
Yeah. So, I mean, I generally buy the arguments for long-termism. I think we're an incredibly unusual time in human history where, firstly, I think we're probably in the first like 0.00001% of people who ever live. Yet at the same time, within one of the first generations where we can really significantly influence the very long run of civilization. And I think it's just those two facts, like once you start to really internalize that, the idea that most of the impact you have is on how you influence the long run of civilization. Because that will be, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years, actually ends up becoming quite compelling, quite intuitive. I do tend to think of that as more like a paradigm rather than a cause area. So one thing is like reducing existential risk mitigation, but there's also things like improving that there has been less work on, I think, such as like broad societal improvements, like especially intergovernmental institutions and so on, that could plausibly impact the extremely, like the very long run of civilization as well. Also value improvements as well, kind of as something that could potentially last an kind of extremely long time. Having said all that, the thing that at least I think about the most in terms of what I focus on, given my competitive advantage, is more what I call cause X. So some cause that is like a radical, would lead to a very significant reprioritization in the current kind of spending of EA resources, where that could be something that we just haven't even thought of at all. Whether that's some new kind of existential risk or some crucial consideration that radically changes our views. Maybe that comes from population ethics or infinite ethics or decision theory or something. Or it could be something that we've just currently deprioritized, but maybe not actually for very good reasons. And so it should have been a much kind of higher priority. So perhaps like reduction in there being a great power war in the 21st century. That's not something that's like a big focus area in EA at the moment, but perhaps it ought to be. So what I'm kind of thinking about most is, what are some of these contenders for kind of cause X? And even if we can't figure it out, even if we think, well, there probably is something that's like the most important thing to do and we just don't know what that is. What does that mean about what we ought to be doing now?
So you mentioned that you are persuaded by sort of long-termist arguments, as you said, and also are interested in this cause X, something we might not have thought about before. How do you think those sorts of focuses play along with the need to attract people and also attract money to the EA movement? Because potentially the sorts of things that people find motivating are maybe more immediate sort of global poverty or animal rights type stuff. So do you think there's any tension there?
Yeah, I think I'd be pretty wary of arguments along the lines of, well, even though I don't believe this thing, I'm going to start talking about this thing because it's a better way of kind of attracting people. Like, I really want people in general to be kind of upfront and honest about their views. So that doesn't mean like present the weirdest version of your view or something. For sure, you like take time to think like, well, what are the arguments for this on like a variety of perspectives and so on. But I don't want to. I don't want people to do a bait and switch or anything. At the same time, I'm just not sure that, so climate change is just like, it's like a standard long-termist thing. Like, obviously it ties into ideas about environmentalism. And, climate change doesn't get talked about that much in EA compared to other things. That's not because of its lack of importance, though. It's just because it's, much, much less neglected than considerations like, man-made pandemics or risks from artificial intelligence. And it's not like climate change has failed in terms of getting a lot of people empowered to really care about this issue. In fact, it's, one of the most successful like social developments in the last, 40, 50 years. And so that suggests that I don't think it's like in the nature of the kind of long-termist causes that people won't, feel empowered and excited about kind of working on these issues. It is, I think it's just a kind of framing effect. And I do think some of the long-term arguments used have been unnecessarily narrow and even alienating sometimes.
So yeah, so in terms of those sorts of arguments which can be alienating or maybe types of ways of thinking that EAs typically engage in, that may in part be related to the traditional sort of feeder communities for effective altruism, particularly people involved in various rationalist communities, AI enthusiasts, and people working in technology. Do you think it's important for us to try to move beyond and expand the EA community into new sort of demographics? And if so, how would we go about doing this?
Yeah, so I do think it's important, because I think, if it was just so, back 6 or 7 years ago, maybe a little even longer, 8 years ago, we were already talking a bit about diversity in EA and so on, and we realized we were like 50% philosophers or something, at least at the Oxford side, and that represents like a narrow skill set, and there's many problems in the world that you don't want philosophers for, and I think we still see that today. Like, there's not nearly enough people with government policy experience and interests in EA as I think would be ideal. Having said that, I actually just do already think, and have seen myself, the people involved with EA getting just broader and broader. Like, very early EA was like extremely heavy on philosophers and computer scientists. That's now much, much broader than it was. And I expect that trend to continue even more as some of the ideas that EA has had and has been championing to get like mainstream acceptance. So I think, and then like some of the work that I'm doing as well, like with the Global Priorities Institute, I think is also going to help that as well, where part of the aim of that institute has been going more slowly through kind of existing arguments. So maybe there's a set of conclusions that EAs buy, and all the infinite steps seem pretty obvious if you've got a certain sort of brain, and the sort of brain that tends to be attracted to the EA community. But like lots of other people, like skeptical at infinite steps like 2, 5, and 7 or something. And so we want to go kind of much more slowly through those arguments. So my overall thought on that is like, one, that this just has been getting better, and I think will continue to get better in the future. And then 2, if there's changes we can make, it's in terms of thinking somewhat more broadly in terms of like the arguments we tend to use, and even just language we tend to use to express some of the points we want to make.
Great. So one thing we wanted to do in this session is give people an opportunity to ask you questions directly. So I'm going to turn to some questions from the floor now, well, via our app system here. So here's one question. Do you think there is a risk of EA over-focusing on some charities that can be easily measured to the detriment of others that are potentially more important but more difficult to measure? And they give the example of governance.
Governance. Yeah, I actually think this isn't a worry. This is like the most common kind of criticism of EA or something. I mean, I think if you look not just at global health and development, but at the kind of overall portfolio of EA, like organizations that EAs fund, and even just look at the proportion of kind of funding as well, most of those organizations are not in the category of like things that are easy to measure. So that's true for basically all existential risk charities. The like core argument for focusing on mitigating existential risk is a quantitative one. It's because, well, the sheer numbers involved in terms of generations you're influencing are just so high. But for any particular organization, there's just like no quantitative arguments you can really make about why fund this organization rather than another. And it's much more on what's the quality of the leadership, how much does the plan kind of make sense, how does this compare in terms of track record of other similar things that have been successful or differ from things that have failed. And so the criticisms that we get in terms of like, well, this isn't thinking enough about governance and so on, I think don't appreciate the fact that the way at least EAs, or the people I know and myself tend to think, is that if you have the kind of epistemology and worldview that you want really like, measurable results, things like AMF and Give Directly kind of look really good. If you then move to epistemology where you're much happier to take, uncertain bets and so on, the standard like development kind of arguments of proving especially like developing world institutions and so on, don't look as compelling as navigating new technologies. And so there's kind of like on neither worldview does this kind of, do these things kind of come out as the most important. And maybe that's wrong, but I think it's like not in the nature of not taking into account the like, more uncertain, harder to measure stuff, because that's actually just a huge bulk of what EA is concerned about now.
That's interesting. I think a lot of people from traditional sort of political activist communities would, well, perhaps not surprisingly, disagree with the idea that if we're looking at a sort of a longer term or more systemic, more uncertain level, that we should focus on, instead of, say, governance reforms and other things. I'd just be curious as to why do you think that that's the case, that we should focus on the more technological side rather than the governance side if we're going down that line?
I mean, a really big thing is just neglectedness, where, take any kind of governance, not any governance question. So there's some things that are neglected. So like I recommended and made a grant to a Center for Election Science that promotes kind of approval voting. So an alternative voting system where you can vote for as many candidates as you like, rather than just voting for one. Very simple change. Mathematical properties are like extremely different. Will result in like much better representation of the will of the people, basically. That is an area like it's very clearly about governance, and it's extremely neglected. Like no one apart from this organization is really talking about it. I know you Australians really love your instant transferable vote. Unfortunately, I'm not a fan of that one either. But so there are some things within governance that are very neglected, but those things are kind of much more rare. Whereas people concerned about technologies that are still like a decade or two off and trying to build what is in a sense like proactive, preemptive governance, just extremely kind of unusual. So that provides this like, think about kind of nuclear weapons. Like imagine if we were being able to spend like decades thinking about the impact of like nuclear weapons on society and what sort of policies and governance we should have had in place. Like it's plausible we could have avoided the Cold War. This is like huge kind of for society. And we're now in that position, but like not for nuclear weapons, which is like much, much harder to kind of roll back to, a small number of nuclear weapons from 14,000 that we have now. Although I'm still very in favor of that. But like when there's this like clean slate of technologies that haven't even been fully developed yet, it seems to me like you've got a much greater chance of like actually just changing what happens because you're not pushing against anyone to begin with. So.
Okay, here's a thorny question for you. So one reason for focusing on existential risk is that extinction would mean that thousands of generations of people would not exist, along with all of the art and science and other achievements that they would produce. But at the same time, there would be all of the potential suffering and destruction caused by humans and also to other animals. So the question that's being asked is, why do you think that our future is net positive?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think it's something that it's really important to discuss and think about, and for more research to be done on. The main reason, well, there's a few reasons, but one of the main reasons I think the future is going to be positive on balance is just that if you imagine the ways in which the future could go really well or the ways in which the future could go really badly, well, one reason for the future going really well, is people really trying to achieve like their aims. And normally when very bad things happen, like suffering on factory farms and so on, it's not that people are like actively trying to create suffering. That happens as a kind of side effect of some other aim they have. So look at, outcome where just everything has been focused on, being as good as possible, or a really bad outcome, you'd have to think, well, everyone's focusing on making things as bad as possible. It seems extremely unlikely that there would be a situation where everyone is trying to focus on making things as bad as possible. That just seems like very kind of skeptical hypothesis. So the much more likely worlds are where people are generally trying to do stuff that's good. Obviously, there's self-interest and so on along the way. And perhaps some things they don't care about as a kind of side effect. Now, I think that as technological progress and wealth increases, we just get better and better at kind of fulfilling our aims. And secondly, as long as there are some people who care, about avoiding suffering and so on, they can kind of trade with the people who perhaps are accidentally creating suffering at the same time. And because they don't care about that intrinsically, it's just like a side effect. Well, then it becomes not very costly for them to kind of engage in that trade. So more concretely, when I think about the kind of very long run, I think it's extremely unlikely that involves factory farming. I think it's unlikely that factory farming will still be around in even 150 years, let alone hundreds of thousands of years. And that's because people don't want animals to suffer. It's just that it's slightly cheaper to do so. As we get wealthier, there becomes less and less of a motivation to do that, especially as there's some core of altruistic people who are getting wealth, who care about animals, and they're getting wealthier as well, and can just kind of trade and effectively buy off the people who are creating the suffering at the moment. And that's kind of what is happening effectively with corporate cage-free campaigns, where there's a small group of people who care a lot and are saying, we're gonna make things annoying for you if you don't stop having caged hens. And you get, as we've seen, we get really rapid uptake of that, because it's not like they don't really care either way. It's not that they actively want this kind of bad thing to happen. And so I'd expect, in the worlds that matter most, which is where civilization is very successful or very large, I would expect that trend to continue.
So this isn't really a question, but it's got such a response that I thought I should mention it. So apparently 24 people in our audience love you, Will, because there's a minus 24 down for that. Vote down if you love Will. So just letting you know that.
Yeah, well, thank you. Love you too.
All right, next question. So a lot of EAs are concerned about the potential for AI development to go in a bad direction if AI goals are not specified correctly and so forth. So do you think that, given that, it would be a good thing for us to try to slow down progress in AI development to give us more time to work these things out? Or that not be a good idea?
Yeah, I'm really agnostic on whether speeding up or slowing down. You've frozen, so I'm going to pause. How can you hear me okay now?
Thanks, guys. Sorry, we're back. We can hear you now.
Okay, terrific. Yeah, so I'm agnostic on whether speeding up or slowing down AI is a good thing or a bad thing. So the case for thinking that slowing down AI progress in general is good is just, well, we've got more time to think about it, as the question asks. The case for speeding it up being good is as follows. One is I think the AI space is just unusually safety conscious relative to my prior. The people who are developing AI right now care about the long-term arguments, or aware of the risks and so on, and are happier to and are listening to all the right people as well, and so actually do really want to build in kind of safety mindset into their organizations as much as possible and actually work on this. If we slow down AI progress in general, it just makes it much more likely that some other country, for example, is going to take the lead in AI development. And it's not necessarily worse, but it's more of a kind of gamble. The second reason is about hardware overhang, where AI, I think, is much less predictable if we're mainly doing it by brute force in virtue of just vast amounts of computational power, rather than as a result of having a good understanding of the algorithms we're using. And hardware progress is just powering along in much the same way as it ever has done. And so the more that you're slowing down AI progress, you're not going to be slowing down hardware progress. And so it means it's more and more likely that someone could build general artificial intelligence without really having any understanding of like the mechanisms by which this is working. It's just that they've thrown so much computational power at it that you kind of get there by brute force methods. And I think that looks more risky than something where we've got a better understanding of what's going on. So overall, I'm just agnostic. I don't think it's something we really want to push on either way.
So shifting gears a little bit, but sort of building on this discussion about brute force computational methods for achieving artificial general intelligence, do you think that the sort of highly intellectual bent towards effective altruism makes it a bit inaccessible to a mainstream audience? And is this a problem?
Cool. I think this is a really important issue because you just generally got, like looking at the history of social movements, you've just got two sorts of movement. One is the kind of grassroots movement. It like builds in a really wide variety of people, empowers them, gets them to do good stuff. And the second is a more, a movement that's like targeting the kind of people who already have power. I think structurally EA kind of has to go on the latter route. And the reason for this is that like the grassroots approach makes a lot of sense if what you're doing is empowering a group that doesn't have a voice. So civil rights, like the clearest kind of case of that, where there's just all of these people who have been treated unbelievably unjustly, and what you're doing is like mobilizing them, bringing them together such that they can like have much more power kind of as a group than they have as individuals. The workers' movement is exactly the same thing. You've got concentrated power in the owners of capital, very unconcentrated, diluted power in workers, but bring them all together and suddenly you have a really powerful force. Unfortunately, when it comes for at least some of the causes effective altruists come up, causes that care about, the beneficiaries aren't able to unify. Non-human animals just can't come together and like rally in the streets like that exist in factory farms. It's just not possible for that to happen. Similarly, the like thousands of generations hence, we like can't build them together into a kind of a voting bloc. So that's like a very important like disanalogy with other sorts of kind of grassroots movements. The other thing is that we are already just very close to the kind of levers of power. And if you can kind of go directly for that, it's like less clear that you need to go via this kind of grassroots thing. So, overall, like my kind of personal disposition kind of favors grassroots approach. But ultimately what EA is about is like trying to do the most good rather than necessarily like getting everyone to become an EA. And so in general, I do think that what we should be trying to do, like, I would much prefer having like 100 very, very dedicated people who really take it seriously and are willing to like really dedicate their lives and careers to these aims than having like 100,000 people who are like donating $2 a month or something. I think the power of people who are like genuinely committed to these goals is like very, very great indeed. Whereas like small changes to behavior, lots of like charity is kind of doing that already. So I think this is like, again, I think this is an important thing to be thinking about, but that's how I'm kind of currently leaning.
Is there a potential difference there with the global poverty type issues where there potentially is a beneficiary group who could rally together? And that's what people have, at least some people have argued, that sort of the developing world or the global poor need to be empowered to sort of assert their rights with respect to the rich world.
Yeah, so it's kind of in between. It's kind of in between where, like, yeah, where at least, the potential beneficiaries are capable of representing themselves and speaking, and like are in the present generation. So like you've got more of a case of mobilization there. Having said that, I think it's like it is also a very large disanalogy if you're like not in the relevant country. Like morally speaking, I think that like Kenyans should have vote president is. Do I think that would like ever happen, like as something we could campaign for? And the answer is no. Like it's just like way beyond kind of political feasibility. Perhaps we could campaign for national and governmental kind of institutions instead, which I think, you know, and like having them be better, that's maybe got kind of more promise. So basically, I'm agnostic on that kind of cause area, where in some ways it's analogous to movements of the past, but also kind of disanalogous, simply because the people there like aren't in the same country, and so it's much easier to continue to disenfranchise them.
Some people have accused effective partly because it's sort of highly intellectual, but also because we don't focus enough, so the criticism goes, on on empowering the voices of the people that we're trying to help, especially in the developing world. Do you think that this is a reasonable criticism, or that there's more we could do on this point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, that's global health and development specific. To be honest, I think that is a reasonable criticism. Like, I think this is actually quite like, you know, like the EA kind of brand and approach is like, well, we're the numbers people. And so in terms of like brand, or, you know, we're the like, you know, trying to be like rational people. And so in terms of like brand differentiation, I think it's really good that we like stayed, you know, kind of stayed true to that message. Like, I think it's important not to get, you know, because I think it's a very important message, and the question is like, how are you changing the debate kind of on the margin? And I think on the margin, it is very important to, you know, I want people to think in that way, like much more than they do. In terms of like genuinely getting a really good understanding, I think like some of the qualitative, like this is just, you know, this is what it's like to be extremely poor in a developing country. And understanding like this is my attitude to like you know, this is my attitude to aid organizations, this is my attitude to the government, and so on. Like, I think that actually just like is good value in terms of like understanding those people's like understanding those perspectives, even in a kind of qualitative way. In addition to kind of having a you know, there are like surveys of like aid recipients and so on in terms of like what do the average kind of opinions look like. So I think that is important in terms of having a good kind of full understanding, and it isn't something that EA like promotes kind of front and center.
So we're just about out of time, so I'll close with a final question. So the theme for our conference this year is stay curious, and to try to encourage people to sort of stay mindful. Can you hear me? Oh, still there?
Yeah, you were cracking up a little bit, but I can hear you.
Yeah. So yes, the theme is stay curious, encouraging people to stay mindful and open to new ideas and challenge their thinking. So in line with that theme, what's something that you have recently changed your mind about with respect to you know, EA and EA causes, and what caused you to change your mind?
Yeah, so ending on a bit of a maybe a bit of a downer, but one of my biggest changes has been having much greater concern about great power war in the 21st century, as in a war between the US and Russia, or the US and China, with US and China being actually the largest kind of update for me. And the kind of precipitation of that was from Graham Allison's book, Destined for War. And it was more as a result of the fact that I hadn't really, basically there being two main considerations that have updated me in this direction, or maybe three. So one is the fact that just like war is the normal state of affairs for humans. We have lived through the 70 years of the Great Peace. This is extremely unusual, basically completely exceptional in terms of human civilization. And it's non-obvious to me whether that's like necessary or contingent. Necessary in the sense of like, well, now we've just got much greater like trade relations and so on, much harder to go to war, like democratic governments, much harder to go to war than it ever has been. Could also just be contingent. Could be contingent on the fact that we've had essentially one superpower, or contingent on the fact that we've had nuclear weapons and a precise balance of technology that leads to mutually assured destruction, that is a massive disincentive to going to war. Also could be luck. There's like tons of close calls in the Cold War. And so that means it's highly non-obvious to me whether, if the technological setup of society changes, technological background changes in the next 50 years, that kind of balance of peace could be altered, and that would be extremely bad. And then the second thing is just in terms of really big catastrophes and even existential risks. The only one that really has a kind of quantitative argument behind it is war, where you can chart the distribution of the badness of wars. It's forms of power law, suggests that in terms of the expected badness of future wars, the majority of that, or at least a significant proportion of the expected badness, comes from the war that kills everybody, and that's excluding all kind of future generations and so on. So I actually think that's something, we should be really concerned about. We're not focusing on it. We're focusing on it very little at the moment. We could go into neglectness questions. That's something I'd love to see more people working on, and something that I wasn't thinking about a year ago, and now keeps me up at night.
So any final, perhaps slightly more positive thoughts that you'd like to end on for us?
Yeah, well, we can do stuff about it. It's within our power to like make this a change. I think the final thoughts is just EA is like an evolving community and movement, and I think it's important we like bear that in mind and kind of respond to that as well. And from my perspective, this huge change of like EA like 9 years ago being this like scrappy thing of like, this is just a bunch of people and they're like trying to give as much money as they can, and it's like we're moving like a few thousands of dollars, maybe up to millions of dollars sort of thing. Now we're in this situation where we've got this like foundation with potential assets of kind of $14 billion behind us. So in terms of the fundraising side, we've had this kind of huge success, and now it means that has like a whole variety of different implications, where one big thing is just like, what are the projects we can build and things that we can do to really kind of like harness the fact that we have such large resources behind us now. And that's this tremendous new challenge, but it's extremely exciting. This is like, we really do, like, even on a global scale, have like significant resources that we can put behind some of these big problems. So even though, and like then in terms of the talent that we've got as well, like all around the world, we just have these like amazingly bright, ambitious, talented and like motivated people. They're exactly the sort of people who I think really can make tremendous differences to the world. And so, some of the problems that we see, like factory farming and new technological developments or kind of great power war, kind of are very large and like very saddening and sometimes very scary. But at the same time, like if anyone is going to make a really big impact on those problems, well, kind of we're in that class. So in a sense, so that is like a great opportunity too.
Great. Well, thanks very much for your time, Will.
Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.
Cool. Thank you. Have a great